packet pushers.
Hello, welcome to the Network Automation Nerds podcast, where we explore the latest in network automation from a practitioner's perspective. I'm your host, Eric Cho, a network engineer who loves everything about network automation. Today on the show, we welcome Scott Robohn. Scott has over 30 years of experience in internet infrastructure. He was bitten by the networking bug around 1990 and found ways to let him do networking stuff. He's served in a variety of roles in network operation, support, engineering, and architecture, most recently as the co-chair of AutoCon. So welcome to the show, Scott.
Eric, thanks. It's great to be here.
We talked a little bit about it before the show. I'm surprised it took me this long to have you on because you've generated so much buzz, so much awareness for network automation, for the community, and we thank you for it. A lot of our hosts have been on and they have nothing but great things to say about AutoCon, so thank you.
You're welcome. My typical response on that is, yeah, we've done some things to shine a light on what's happening in network automation and to amplify it, but I think what we really did was tap into a real hunger and a real vein of work. I don't want to take credit for what people are actually doing. We've just been able to put a wrapper around it and bring a little more attention to it. That's the way I think about it.
I think you're being too humble, because if that was the case, it would have been done a long time ago, right? It wasn't for a lack of trying, but it was for the right people at the right time with the right effort. And like you said, really tap into that well, and it just kind of exploded to me.
That's fair. And I'm not trying to be falsely humble. It has been a lot of work, don't get me wrong, but Chris and I have had a great time doing it. And it's something that we have passion for. And that obviously makes it so much easier when you feel so strongly about a technology and a project.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back into what I usually ask from my guests. I know we mentioned you have over 30 years of experience and over that time frame. And I've also listened to a few of your podcasts, as well as you being a guest on other people's podcasts, exploring your background. It's very interesting because when I read on your LinkedIn profile, you described yourself as a player's coach. And that's very different than what a lot of people talked about being a leader, being a leadership role. So I'm interested in why you describe yourself as a coach.
So the way I've always thought of it, team sports have always been a paradigm for life for me. I love NCAA men's basketball.
Oh, wow. This is a great time for you then.
Yeah. So March, we're recording this in March 2024. It is the height of March Madness. People can't see the video. I'm wearing my Syracuse orange hat. They did not make the tournament this year.
Oh, no.
But that coaching and being able to play in a role has always made a lot of sense to me. And you need to figure out where you need to employ which skill set. Do I have to get a specific task done here or project done? Or do I have to help guide others and enable others through the process? From a tech perspective and network engineering, being close to the tech has always been really important to me. I've never wanted to have tech engineers or SEs that I was responsible for doing things and talking about things I at least didn't have some clue about.
Right.
So it wasn't a tactic. It wasn't a strategy for me. I've always been drawn to understanding what's happening at the protocol level, at the hardware level. I want to understand it so I can communicate with my team more effectively. It's a matter of, again, am I dialing more to player or dialing more to coach in a given situation, a given role, or a given company?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. And that resonates with me because most of the time when you think of a coach, a lot of times they were players themselves. And they could be a part of either a lead or following, but at the same time, they're enabling others to do the best they could, to be the best version of themselves. And that really is what it means to me when I see the term coach, right? Because leader, it almost gives the impression of you're leading a team and you're at the front. But as a coach, the players are still playing. Like, there's no way you could replace that, but you're a coach and you're enabling others. So it's great that you describe yourself as a player, as a coach, and be close to the tech. We know we touched a bit on it already. So what's your origin story? How did you get into tech and in particular network engineering?
This could be a much longer episode. I'll try to keep the bio to at least 4 or 5 pages in the comic book. Right?
For sure.
So if I think back to high school, that's when I first got exposed to computers. At the very small school I went to, we had an Apple II, we had a TRS-80.
Oh, wow.
At home, the very first computer I ever had was a little Timex Sinclair 99.4A with a cassette drive hooked up to a tiny little black and white television for a monitor. And the first real project that I remember, besides Hello World, was writing a little basketball statistics program for high school basketball. That was kind of fun. That, set me on a path to studying engineering in college. I went to RIT for my undergrad. Go Tigers. RIT is a co-op school. So it's a 5-year undergrad where the first 2 years are standard, school. Then starting your third year, you alternate terms of work and terms of school to help me pay for school, help me figure out what I liked, what I didn't like. I studied industrial engineering as a discipline, and that kind of gave me a systems and process view of things. Other engineering disciplines like to call, i.e., imaginary engineering. I got through an undergrad without having to take a circuits class. So I don't know what that tells you about me. It exposed me to a very important statistician named W. Edwards Deming, who has done a lot of work that has flown into not just from manufacturing engineering, but into DevOps. And we'll come back and talk about that with network operations too.
Sure.
I headed off to grad school at Penn State and, basically studied frustrated applied math. Operations research is a kind of really narrow optimization field. And some of the computer integrated manufacturing lab work I did, I had to network some PCs with DECnet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, this is really cool. I had to read manuals and figure it out. It wasn't a class. I didn't have anybody to really go to. It was really just transferring small files around. So it's pretty simple and nothing mission critical. That's where I got bit by the network bug. And early in my career, even though I didn't go into network engineering roles right away, I was always finding ways to do networky stuff, help make Ethernet cables, pull cables. I actually got into a role where I could use my academic background of simulation and modeling techniques to analyze really noisy radio environments and figure out, well, how would asynchronous transfer mode or ATM work in those lossy environments? And that's when I really started gravitating toward, my next job is going to be a networking job. So I ended up at a telco. Bell Atlantic, which is now part of Verizon, was the biggest network that you could ever play on.
Right.
And the Bell Atlantic merger with 9X, took the whole Northeast. There were a lot of routers in that network. And they started out being all Bay Networks routers, and eventually many of them became Cisco routers. A longer story there.
Let me interrupt you right there.
Sure.
You were on the Imposter Syndrome podcast, and that was a great episode. I mean, we'll include the link in the show notes. And, I encourage people to go back to that. You also mentioned here the kind of interesting college where you have 50% of hands-on and 50% of, kind of hardware book knowledge. As a parent of two who, I think in a few years they're going to go off to college, I'm wondering, how do you see that? Did that have an impact on your life? And do you think that's the way things are going to go? And I'm really curious about that because, it impacts all of us. And a lot of listeners of the show have reached out to me and asked me the question of, do you think college is still relevant, right? Do you think the formal education or, you go for the certification route? So all of these, I think, kind of goes back into your view on the role between practical experience as well as book knowledge.
So I'm a huge fan of practical experience, and I have always been able to learn by doing. I've never been able to be an academic and work my way down. And that's been really applicable in my networking career. So if you're going to choose to go the formal education route, undergraduate or more, I think co-op is a great approach. I did not have great finances, and co-op was a very practical way for me to help pay for a lot of my schooling. Some students that get into co-op programs will hire on with companies they co-op with. I didn't. It was more for me. It was like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. But it was still valuable experience, and you're picking up as you go. My son took a different route. He got his comp sci degree from Virginia Tech and co-opted and interned with a defense contractor that he ended up working with for 8 years after he graduated. And it worked out really well for him.
Oh, wow.
I think there's a bigger conversation around how much of what we do requires an undergraduate education.
Right.
I think one size does not fit all. I'll say, my 90s experience of being able to get into network engineering without any direct formal education in it, but having the ability to do and learn, that was what's most important. If a college degree helps you with that, great. If practical experience or just the ability to power through gets you that, great. Military folks, right? The transition from military to the commercial workplace. There's so many good folks that make that transition and do really well in network engineering roles in particular. I might be going astray a little bit from your original question.
It's great because I had the same experience for me. I did a lot of internships and co-ops while I was at school.
Right.
And what you talked about, at least what you would get is what you don't want to do. So I think if you keep an open mind and don't limit yourself, for example, when I did my internship, one was at retail at Kmart, if people even know what that is, they're gone and they're no longer at Kmart. But retail gave me the kind of exposure I would not have had. If I was working in high tech the whole way, give me that personal skills and knowing how the daily grind for a retail person standing on your feet 8 hours a day, doing inventory and all that. And at the same time, another internship I had was with Morgan Stanley Dean Witter for wealth management in a pretty well-off area in Orange County, California region. And that's a totally different perspective. So back to what you were talking about, at the experience, give your exposures, doesn't really matter which field. It's always valid. And at the very least, you cross that off and go, well, I don't think that's for me.
Another way I package some of what we've just said here is all experience is cumulative.
Right.
Right. You go through a set of experiences. It's very rare where you can say, well, this has nothing to do with what I do today.
Right.
It all adds up. It might be in smaller ways, but your retail experience, showing up, going through the grind, being on your feet 8 hours a day, those are important skills, even though they don't have anything to do with OSPF or MPLS. Right.
Right. And just learning from others as well, being humble,
Yep.
Take directions, that sort of stuff. So I think, as you were mentioning, and this is a great segue back into what you were talking about, early in your career, you had to hustle, right? And that's part of
Yep.
what you were talking about on the imposter syndrome, is perhaps you feel like you were not up to par as to somebody, which is not true, right? You compare your first day to somebody on their 10th year or whatnot. But let's talk a little bit about that. You were telling us about working at telcos in the beginning of maybe the early 90s.
Correct. Mid to late. I think I landed at Bell Atlantic in 96 or 97. It was 96.
Right when the internet took off.
Yeah, it was great timing. And just, to give a hat tip to Chris and Zoe on the Imposter Syndrome Network.
Yep.
If you haven't listened to that, they have some great guests, and everybody relates to feeling like an imposter. Like, I don't belong here, and some people just admit it more readily than others, but lots of good listens there for sure. As I was kind of finding my way through this big networking organization and just kind of learning about T1 framing and DS3 framing and MLPPP with 12 T1s in and out of a campus, I was just soaking it up, learning. Got exposed to my first automation tasks there too, Perl scripts and TCL/TK. I got to work with a really, really talented individual. His name's Phil. Phil, I don't know if you're listening to this. I hope you're doing well, man. But he was the brains. And I just got to ride along and learn and do little pieces of it. So what you need to be open to wherever you go. So the example of really feeling like an imposter, I'll just call it out. When I landed at Juniper, I was a trainer. I came there from being a Cisco and a 4 systems trainer, learned BGP, being a trainer at Juniper. Then I moved into the TAC organization. And the difference between being a trainer and being a TAC engineer, trainers, you need to know protocols and ports and how things are supposed to work. TAC, you learn how everything breaks.
Oh my God, yeah.
So you see the worst of it. And nobody calls you in TAC to thank you and say, you're doing a great job, Eric.
Right.
Thanks for keeping the network up. No,
That's right.
the network's down and it's because of your gear and you need to fix it right now. So
insert a few profanity.
More than one, depending on the customer.
Exactly.
I was very aware of, I don't really know what I'm doing and I'm still learning. You don't want to ask that wrong question on the support-private alias because there's a couple escalation engineers that are going to have some choice words. Read the fine manual, read the fantastic manual. So I think there is, on the one hand, you bear some responsibility for learning and knowing and doing a minimal amount of homework. By the same token, I think we really need to be careful and make sure people are comfortable asking questions because you get to resolution so much faster if you have an environment where you're not going to jump down somebody's throat if they ask a stupid question. I kind of took that away from my TAC experience. I survived there for 5 years as a TAC engineer. I can't remember the last time I did any one thing for 5 years. So I had a really good boss there.
Let's pause for just a moment to tell you about Human Infrastructure and Packet Capture, 2 weekly Packet Pushers newsletters you can subscribe to for free. Human Infrastructure delivers informative technical blogs, links to tech resources and tools, plus IT news stories and new product announcements, all with commentary by the Packet Pushers. There's also Packet Capture, a weekly digest of everything the Packet Pushers have published over the past 7 days, including podcasts, blogs, and YouTube videos. It's an easy way to find the episodes and content you want. Sign up for one or both for free at packetpushers.net/newsletters. We don't sell or share your email address with anyone. It's just between us.
Yeah, it's amazing that you did it for 5 years because I was at Juniper Tech as well, but I was in the NetScreen division and I know how hard it could be. I don't know about the Junas Tech, but at least for NetScreen, we had contractors that does the tier 1 and tier 2. So by the time it gets to the buck stops here and there's nobody else to pass it on to. So you're it. And that's tremendous amount of pressure that lands on your shoulders.
For sure. Yeah. And Junos Tech, we had outsourced tier 1 as well. I won't embarrass them publicly here, but there are at least a couple awesome Juniper SEs that came out of that outsourced tier 1 TAC relationship because you learn, right? And when you see how things break, you know how to design things to avoid certain problems.
Yeah. And interesting you mentioned about the difference between a trainer and a TAC engineer. When you have everything all set up and it's all nice and shall we say a few of the smoke screens that you put up and everything's working correctly, it's very different when things are broken and you're under the pressure. You got that 4-hour clock at the SLAs that's ticking.
Correct.
Yeah, so that's a totally different mindset, and interesting that you brought it up.
Very complimentary. I mean, I'm so glad that I had the experience, even the pressure from some of the engineers that maybe were a little rougher than I wish they were. It was it's good. It was, again, all cumulative. It all adds up to the body of knowledge I have today.
And I think that's a different time, as you alluded to back then versus now. People are much more aware. People are much more emphasized on empathy versus before. I remember that time, as you mentioned, people had some choice words and it was almost a different culture, more Silicon Valley-like culture, I would say.
Remember the phrase, flame suit on or flame on.
Yeah.
There was a bit of chest beating. I just got in this flame war with such and so. And it's like, okay, how did that help you resolve the customer's issue, get to case closure faster? It probably really didn't. So
yeah. Did those experiences help? Because I know later on, also at Juniper, you went into a leadership role. You were leading the sales org or the SE org. So tell us a little bit about that.
I'm probably one of the most fortunate individuals that you'll meet. I did not have a plan. That wasn't a career goal of mine. Out of the TAC and customer service organization, I saw what SE roles look like.
Right.
I thought, boy, that looks really interesting. And I don't need to carry a pager if people remember what pagers are. I actually had a BlackBerry. I think TAC were the first people to get BlackBerries back then. I bugged an SE manager enough to actually have the opportunity to interview for a partner SE role. And then I moved into leading a team in the partner SE organization, moving on to direct teams. I ended up on the Verizon team for quite some time, which I really, really enjoyed, the salespeople and the SEs and the customer. And from there, I actually moved into leading the Americas SE team. I think we had over 250 SEs at that point. And it's different dynamics, right? You're not so much player coach there, right? Because you're dealing with 2 or 3 layers of managers underneath you before you actually get to the frontline SEs. And you're doing different things and you're coaching different ways. You're leading different ways in those roles. And I loved it. A really, really valuable experience.
What was the biggest challenge that you saw going from a direct frontline or mid-level leadership manager to, several layers removed from the day-to-days for SEs? So what's the biggest challenge that you see and what's the recommendation you would give people if their aspiration is to be at that level?
You have to learn to let go of things. That's the easy answer.
Okay.
And it's something I still wrestle with today. There's the matter of scale. Right? You're not going to scale across a team that size if you try to keep doing all the individual contributor things you did, plus try to do the things you need for the broader team and running interference for them and enabling them. You'll go crazy if you don't learn to delegate, but you'll also stifle people on your team if you keep trying to doing things for them that they actually should have the opportunity to do. So that delegation is doubly useful, your own personal scale and developing people on the team. For people like me, when you're wired, I'll just do it myself.
Right.
You have to resist the urge. You have to constantly remind yourself, maybe you need people to, hey, you're going to watch me, try to take this task back from you. And I want you to tell me no. I've had conversations like that before. So
I've never been in a role like that. And I'm really curious, how do you let go? I know you mentioned, perhaps you're not wired that way, quote unquote, but eventually you succeeded, right? Like eventually you were able to develop your team and lead a bigger team. And, the sum of the individual parts is greater than all of them, just individually. So is there any lesson that you took away from that besides just letting go? And how do you do it?
Well, so it's a matter of comfort level.
Okay.
I think it's hardest for the individual that moves into their first management role.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first place where you really need to deal with that. And then you develop a skill set and you understand what being comfortable with that looks like. There are at least two really practical things associated with that. Number one, you have to be comfortable with things getting done, but not your way. And that's okay,
Mm-hmm.
right? What matters is the result. There, of course, are some boundaries. We're not being complete pragmatists here, but people can do things differently. And that's not only okay, it's actually really good, right? There's a biodiversity picture there that I'm not really qualified to comment on, but you also have to be willing to accept failure, like things not getting done or not getting done correctly, which is different from just being done differently. What do you do, right? When things don't get done or are done poorly? It depends, right? What are the ramifications? How do I coach this person? Give them feedback. Some people you might want them to ask for feedback before you give it. Others you might want to proactively give it. It kind of depends on personality and dynamics there.
Do you actually tell people upfront that's your style? So please just let me know if, I'm overstepping or this is the way that I want you to communicate back to me upfront.
I have done certain things like that. A standard pitch when I'm new in any organization is, you're here because you are smarter than me, and I need you to be smarter than me. I don't know all the details of all this. You have to be able to feel free to speak up and share what you see, about a given situation. You also need to feel free to tell me when you disagree with me or you think I'm doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I would prefer that it not be a reply all to the entire team or in a group
All
meeting.
200 SCs in the US.
Even at lower levels too, right? I've had the same conversation. Really do want people to feel empowered and to be able to speak their mind in the right context. We'd like to avoid unnecessary embarrassment. Sometimes it happens and that's okay. But really just making sure people know I value who you are and what you bring to the table.
Yeah, that's interesting because in just 30 minutes of our conversation, I could just tell that, you've gone through so much change in different roles. You're always able to pick things up right away, even though the roles and responsibilities are vastly different. So this is something you talked about in the Imposter Syndrome podcast as well. And I wanted to ask you this because I think it's valuable for the listener to know. At what point do you feel you could slow down a little bit and have more confidence?
Our prep for the show and the questions and notes you provided really caused me to think through this a little bit.
Okay.
And I don't feel like I could nail it down to a particular event.
Mm-hmm.
I have the sense that it was probably about 10 years ago.
Okay.
So maybe call it 2014-ish, when I was in the Verizon SE leader role. I started to really get comfortable in my own skin and not feel like I had more to prove, I think is a good way to think about it. Now, context is important too. I had a sales partner who was awesome, and we had a sales leader for the Americas SP sales org who was also awesome. So I think that contributed to it. So some combination of being teamed with the right partners and the right leadership and just kind of getting comfortable with, okay, this is who I am. And it's not like the tax scenario where I don't know how I got here and I'll just work longer. I'll just show up and I'll keep working harder.
Right.
You're going to drive yourself into the ground if you continue with that mode. It's only been about 10 years that I could say that I've really had the level of confidence to kind of calm down and back off. That's my reflection on, you throwing the question out there.
Yeah. And I thank you for that honest answer. I think it's very useful for people to just listen to you and knowing that maybe it will happen in 20 years, maybe it'll happen in 10 years, but eventually it'll happen. And it's kind of a recursive process that you just have to keep at it. So I think this is probably a good time to wrap up part one. Where can people find you, follow you, find your work?
The best place is LinkedIn. Scott Robohn. There aren't too many of me. I have not found any other Scott Robohns. Robohn. And I'm also Scott Robohn on X. I'm done calling it Twitter. It's X,
It's X.
even though I just called it Twitter.
That's right.
But those are great places to reach out. And, LinkedIn seems to be a really great confluence of lots of good technical work and communication these days.
People are a little nicer on LinkedIn too. So that's a added benefit. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Network Automation Nerds. Do you have any feedbacks for Network Automation or this episode or for Scott? Send me some follow-ups at packetpushers.net/fu. I want to hear from you. Check out our website at packetpushers.net to find other network engineering focused podcasts, blogs, YouTube videos, and Slack channels. Last but not least, remember that too much network automation will never be enough.